All right, so today we're going to be talking about loops, which is a concept that we use in programming a lot when we want to repeat certain actions over and over and over again. In Python, there are two kinds of loops. There's a while loop and there's a for loop. So in this video, I will be covering the first type, which is while loops. The next couple of videos will be covering for loops, and that's kind of it for loops in Python. Although if you are in person, every once in a while, if your teacher has a particularly sweet tooth, you get a third kind, which is Fruit Loops, but unfortunately we're not in person, so we're kind of stuck with just two. And without further ado, we're gonna jump into the first kind, which is while loops. So like I mentioned before, while loops are used often when you have some piece of code that you wanna repeat. And why might you have code that you wanna repeat? One of the main motivations is if you have something that you want to do multiple times. I don't know if you know, but there's a song, the original says 99 bottles of beer, but if you're like me and you've never had alcohol, you can substitute this for whatever beverage of choice you want. So in this case, we have coffee. In the example that I will show you later, I'll be using tea. But the basic premise of the song is you have 99 bottles of some drink stocked up on shelves on your wall. For whatever reason, you have a hell of a lot of liquid. And as the song progresses, you take one by one these bottles off the shelf on your wall, you pour it out, you drink, you have a good time. Then you realize you want some more, and then you go and get another bottle. So the way this song goes is 99 bottles of, well, in this case, cold brew, or I'll shorten it to coffee, 99 bottles of coffee on the wall, 99 bottles of coffee, take one down, pass it around, 98 bottles of coffee on the wall, 98 bottles of coffee on the wall, 98 bottles of coffee, take one down, pass it around, 97 bottles of coffee on the wall. And the song just kind of keeps on going, so on and so forth, until eventually you run out of bottles, and then you get a little depressed and go out to get more drinks. And so if you were to write this in code kind of right off the bat, how you would do it, I started off with tea because I get caffeinated in the morning with tea. You kind of start off with this. So you would use print statements like we've been doing so far. So 99 bottles of tea on the wall, one print statement. 99 bottles of tea, second print statement. Take one down, pass it around. I kind of put them together because it just made sense in my head. Then 98 bottles of tea on the wall. So that's all fine and good for the first like 4 lines of that song. But as you can see, we started at the number 99. And if we're gonna get down to the point where there are 0 bottles of tea left on the wall, it's gonna take some time. Because if you kept on going with this, then you would have to print, and then go 98 bottles of tea on the wall. Print 98 bottles of tea. Print some more. Take one down. I could have copied and pasted, I suppose. Pass it around. Print 97 bottles of tea on the wall. And as you can tell, this will take a while if we just keep on typing print statements all the way down. And it will also get super long. Because right now this is all we got, but this is nowhere near most of the song that we're trying to actually sing or print out to the screen. So that's one reason why we might say like, hey, something that you'll notice about the song is there's kind of a pattern where you have some number of bottles of tea on the wall, some number of bottles of tea, take one down, pass it around, one less bottle of tea left on the wall. Even though the number of actual bottles there itself changes every time, it's still kind of the same pattern. You have tea on the wall, you have tea on the wall, you take a bottle out, you have less tea. And so this is motivation number 1. Sometimes in code, you will have situations where you have actions that you want to repeat over and over and over again, but you don't want to write all those lines of code over and over and over again. So that's kind of motivation number 1. Another usage or motivation number 2 would be sometimes loops can help you handle if a user's doing something wrong. Fortunately or unfortunately, humans are not computers, and so humans will often make mistakes. And it's easy for users to make mistakes whenever they have to type in answers, whenever it's not something like just pick like A, B, or C, or D. If it's like type in your name, it's easy for people to type in the wrong thing. And so ideally, instead of just kind of saying, you typed something wrong, or saying, I don't know how to read this, I'm gonna quit, peace out, see you later, goodbye, we're gonna explode. Instead of doing something like that, we wanna be able to find a way to give users a chance to try again. For example, if you try to log in to a website and type your password wrong, you don't want the website to just crash on you. You want it to say, hey, you typed it wrong, but I'm going to give you another chance. Please type in your password again. And so this would be a second situation in which we could use loops to accomplish a goal. So kind of what that would look like would be, in that scenario, if you want to give a user a chance to type in the correct thing that you were expecting them or hoping that they would type in, kind of the idea of how you would want to structure that would be to say, hey, I want to repeat a bunch of actions while a user has not entered one of the two values that I'm expecting. So in this case, the code that we have on the slide over here corresponds to this code over here in which we're asking, do you want cream, yes or no? And if a person types in Q, that's not something that we're handling yet. So we're going to say, oops, invalid choice. But we don't want to just quit. We want to, like we do on the left, instead we want to be like on the right where we say, oops, invalid choice, but then ask the user again to type in something that we were expecting or that we can handle. And so kind of the thought process behind what you would do there is say, basically, while a user has not entered in something that we were expecting or something that's not correct, we want to keep on asking them over and over and over again until we get a correct answer or something that we can work with. And so that's why we write while loops. These are loops that let us repeat something over and over, whether it's just you have something that needs to repeat a certain number of times, or if you want to repeat an action until you get the correct input from a user. While loops are super useful in both those situations. A while loop is kind of similar to the if structure in the sense that you depend on a condition. You depend on like a statement, you depend on a fact to be true in order for your code to run. Because the idea behind a while loop is that while a specific condition is true, while a fact is true, while like something just makes sense, you want to repeat a block of code, which is a couple lines of code that kind of all get attached together. You want to repeat that block of code, those lines of code over and over and over again, as long as the condition is still true every single time. But if the condition is ever false, if your statement is no longer true, if your fact is suddenly false, then that's when you're going to stop your loop, you're going to exit your loop, and whatever code you've written, you're just going to carry on your merry way. And so the basics of it kind of look something like this. You start off, kind of as the name implies, you start off with the word while. So while, so that's the first line that you would have in your code. While, and then you have a condition. So the condition would be that statement or fact that is going to be true for you to run your loop over and over again. So while some condition is true, while some condition or fact makes sense and is valid, then you're going to have some code over here that is going to run. And the logic behind that, if you want to see what it looks like kind of like as a diagram, you kind of start, you take once you reach the part of the code that has your while loop, then you're going to say, okay, is the condition that I've written out over here, is it true? If it's true, we're going to run this piece of code that we have attached to this while loop. So we're going to run the statement. And after we're done running, we're going to go back and check to see if the condition is still true. If the condition is still true, we're going to run that statement, that piece of code over there again. And we're going to keep on running until eventually, if the condition is false, then we're going to exit the loop. We're not going to keep on going in the circle over and over and over again. And instead, we're going to move on to the next part of our code, which in this case is statement 2. So if we're going to transform this song into something like a while loop, we would do it something like this. So kind of the first step in a while loop is isolating what are the actions that you want to repeat over and over again. In our case, it's these 4 lines of code over here, which are printing out part of the song, X number of bottles of drink on the wall. And so we're like, okay, this is the block of code that we want to repeat. So that's kind of part 1. Figure out what code to repeat. But this in itself is not a loop. If you run your code right now, it's just going to run once and stop. So we need to figure out what condition, what situation in which we want to keep on repeating this piece of code over and over again. And so that's going to be, it's going to look a little funky because I'm going to write this on top, but that's going to be part 2. I can type, I swear. Part 2, figure out what needs to be true for our code to keep running. So we're going to start off with a while, and then some condition is go. I'm going to fill in this condition with an actual condition later. I'm just typing it out for formatting purposes. So while the condition that you're going to figure out in part 2, while this condition is true, then you're going to run all the code over here, which you need to indent over. So there's the while on this vertical line over here. Then over all the code that's going to run if that condition is true is indented 1 indent over. This is super important. Python's super picky. It will matter whether or not you indent or not. So please indent all the code that's associated with your while loop. So however many lines are associated with as part of that block within your while loop, please indent all of them over. It's a common mistake. It will impact your code. If you don't have that indent, please indent your code. Okay, going back to the while loop, this is the basic structure. You start off with the word while. You say there's some condition or some fact that I want to keep on checking to see if it's true. And while this statement is true, or if every time we check to see if the statement is true, it is still true, run all this code down here. So in this case, we want to keep repeating this over and over again until we have no more bottles left on the wall. And right now we don't really have any. Right now, every single time if we ran this loop, it would just print out 99 bottles. So in this situation, we need a way to count down the number of bottles. So we need to remove a bottle every time we go through this loop. So over here, remove the bottle. We also need to print, obviously, the text that says we're having fun time. So print. I guess those are the two, like part A, part B, and part 1. So we need to have some way to track how many bottles we actually have. And this will also help us form that condition to say like, hey, number of bottles, is it still greater than 0? So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a variable up here, which is going to be an int that counts number of bottles that are, that we have. And so for us, we're going to start that off as, let's say, bottle count. We're going to start that off with 99 because that's where our song starts. So 99 bottles of tea on the wall, we can start substituting that out as well. So in this case, we have bottle count. Tea on the wall. I'm just going to put this everywhere that we have that 99. So we print out number of bottles of tea on the wall, number of bottles of tea. Then you got to take one down, pass it around. And at this point, we need to subtract 1 from our current number of bottles. So there are a couple different ways you can write this, but I'm going to write this in this style for clarity. So bottle count is going to now be whatever the bottle count is right now minus 1. Again, there are multiple ways to write it. I'm just writing this out so it's just super, super clear. Then after we've removed 1 bottle off of our wall, then we're going to print the new number. Then it's 1 less than what it was previously, so we can just do the same bottle count. Number of bottles of tea on the wall. So that helps us make it more dynamic so that every time, so that we're not hard coding the number of bottles on the wall, but that every time we go through this loop, we are actually counting down the bottles that we do have. So that kind of takes care of the inside of the loop. Now we need to actually use that bottle count to help us form the condition, because the condition in which our code needs to keep running is we still have bottles of tea. So condition is number of bottles is greater than 0. because if you don't have any more bottles on the wall, you can't take any bottles down from the wall. So our condition is we want to keep printing this song over and over and over again while we have greater than 0 bottles. And how can we tell that? Well, we have this variable up here, which tracks the number of bottles that we do have. So let's say while bottle count is greater than 0, then print out the bottle song. So print that out. Then we get 99 bottles of tea on the wall, 99 bottles of tea, take one down, pass it around, 98 bottles of tea on the wall, and so on and so forth until eventually 0 bottles of tea on the wall. And there you go. And instead of having one print statement for each one of these lines that we have scrolling over here, we just have, not including the comments, 1 line over here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of code that prints all this stuff. So that's kind of the beauty of while loops, is instead of writing a hell lot of code, you can just write a couple of lines that'll repeat themselves over and over, and then you're good to go. So that's kind of that. So that's the first part, which is you have a couple lines of code that you want to repeat over and over again for a certain number of times. That's kind of that common use case number 1. Use case number 2 is, hey, I want to keep on asking the user for correct input if they keep on screwing up, if they keep on messing up. And so in the example that we have over here, first you start off by actually asking the user for the first time, do you want cream? Yes or no? And so like we've been doing so far, you use input to take in whatever the user types in on the keyboard, store that in a variable called answer. And so if we were just coding this like we have been doing so far, what we would be doing, and we're just doing one check, we would have something like if the answer is not a Y and it's not a, sorry, I'm gonna type a little on the fly here. If the answer is not a Y and the answer is not an N, we're gonna print, sorry, incorrect. So, and then maybe you would try to get input correctly a second time. But if you don't have, so if you had something like this, which is how we've been kind of doing things so far, is if they didn't type it in a correct input, you kind of say sorry and you move on. This doesn't allow us to handle those situations where you want to give your user a chance to retry. But if you change it so that instead you have a while loop, then you can have a piece of code that says while the user hasn't typed in a Y or the user hasn't typed in an N, basically repeat the above. Ask, do you want cream, yes or no? And every time you do this, because you're using this input function to get in whatever the user types in the keyboard at that moment, the value that this variable answer is going to hold is going to change. So every time you go through this while loop, you run this piece of code, you run up here, you check to see if this condition is still true. Whatever value answer holds, it's going to be different. And so you're just going to keep on repeating over and over and over again until eventually answer changes so that it isn't Y or it is an N, and then you can carry on your merry way. So that would be common use case number 2. One of the dangers though with loops, they're very useful. They're really fantastic when you use them. I use them all the time at work, especially in the situations where if you need to handle like bad input or you need to repeat code over and over again, like they're fantastic. But one of the pitfalls that you may run into when you have loops is sometimes if you don't structure your loop correctly, you may have something that's called an infinite loop. And this happens when the condition that you're checking for never becomes false. The condition that you're checking for is always true. So you need to make sure that when you do write your loop, there is always a way to exit your loop. So for example, a situation where we might have an infinite loop would be something like if we never actually updated the number of bottles we had. If we forgot to do this line over here that says, okay, now that we've had a bottle, subtract, If we don't actually do that, then bottle count is always going to be 99. And if we play the song again, never updating the value of bottle count over here, because the other lines over here, nothing changes, nothing changes, nothing changes. The only line that changed the value of bottle count was line 14, and currently we've commented it out, so that code will not run. If we run the song again, you'll notice that every single time we print that there's 99 bottles of tea on the wall, and also you'll notice this thing doesn't stop. It keeps going. It's getting a little annoying, it's getting a little old, and if your user is staring at this on the screen, they're gonna go, what the heck is this? And so the reason why our loop is not stopping is because we're never updating the value of bottle count. And so bottle count is always 99, and 99 is always gonna be greater than 0. So this loop will run forever until you hit stop in PyCharm. But your user's not always gonna be able to hit stop in PyCharm, so you need to not do stuff like this. Make sure there's always a way for this condition over here to be eventually false, which we do by subtracting from bottle count over and over and over again until bottle count is equal to 0. So just kind of reviewing again, tips for designing a loop body, especially if you're new to the idea of programming in loops. One thing that you can start off with is writing out the algorithm or what code what you're trying to do within the loop. Write it out in comments first. So like I'm doing over here where I say part 1, figure out what code to repeat. We're going to print the bottle song. We're going to remove bottle. Start with that first so you can kind of isolate in your head what are the actions, what is the code that I want to repeat over and over and over again. And then also then there's part 2, which is figuring out what needs to be true to keep running. And as kind of part 2, also trying to figure out like what variables you might need to form that condition. So we created this variable over here called bottle count. And so that's what we're using over here to actually track the number of bottles and to also be part of that condition that checks to see, hey, have we run out of bottles yet? And so make sure you have the actions in your loop body, make sure you know what variables to initialize, and then also make sure that if you're doing something after the loop that you know what that is. So in this case, we don't have anything yet, but if we wanted to do something like print done with song, and then also as part of the loop, I'm gonna add a print statement so you can see kind of the separation between parts of the loop. So every part of the loop, bottle of tea on the wall, bottle of tea on the wall, take one down, pass it around, no more bottles of tea on the wall, and then you finished your loop, because you'll notice that this line over here, print done with song, is in the same level of indentation as the while, so it's not part of this indented block over here. It's a completely separate thing. So here's the code that you're running after your loop is done. So that's kind of the structure of when you're doing a loop body. When you are initializing those values before the loop begins, make sure that you're setting it off to the correct default values. So like here, we started it off with 99. This variable was created outside of our loop. It was initialized outside of our loop, and we're going to use it inside the loop. So make sure you kind of know what variables you're using as part of the loop, what you're updating, where you're updating, does it make sense? And then if you're updating variables, especially if you're using variables as part of the condition, again, make sure that if this variable is a value that you're checking for over and over again, eventually that there's something that can change that value. Because otherwise, if it never changes and it's always true, your while loop will keep running over and over and over again. And so make sure that that variable can change and also that it will get you to a spot where you end the loop. And so that's kind of the beginnings of how you do a while loop in Python.